Before we begin, if you value honest history and in-depth documentaries, support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories remembered. And now, let us begin. The Holocaust, the greatest crime of the 20th century. Origins of hatred and the collapse of moral boundaries. The Holocaust did not emerge suddenly from the chaos of war. It was the result of a long process in which prejudice evolved into ideology, ideology became law, and law transformed into mass murder. To understand how one of the most systematic crimes in human history became possible, it is necessary to examine the political, social, and cultural conditions that allowed hatred to become normalized. Antisemitism had existed in Europe for centuries, but it was not always genocidal in nature. For much of history, Jews were persecuted primarily on religious grounds. They were segregated, restricted in professions, and periodically subjected to violence. However, the late 19th century introduced a dangerous transformation. Hatred was no longer framed solely as religious difference, but as racial science. Pseudoscientific theories claimed that humanity was divided into biologically distinct races, locked in a struggle for survival. Jews were no longer seen as individuals who could assimilate or convert, but as a permanent racial threat. These ideas gained traction during a period of rapid social change, industrialization, and political instability. Germany's defeat in World War I created a climate in which such theories flourished. The country faced economic collapse, hyperinflation, political violence, and national humiliation. Many Germans searched for simple explanations for their suffering. Extremist movements exploited this desperation, offering clear enemies and false solutions. Jews were falsely accused of undermining the nation from within. They were blamed for economic hardship, political instability, and military defeat. These myths were repeated relentlessly in newspapers, speeches, and propaganda. Over time, lies hardened into accepted beliefs. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, anti-Semitism was elevated from social prejudice to official state ideology. The Nazi worldview defined history as a racial struggle and portrayed Jews as the ultimate enemy of the German nation. This ideology justified exclusion, violence, and eventually extermination. The transformation was gradual but relentless. Jewish citizens were removed from public life through a series of laws and decrees. Doctors lost licenses, lawyers were disbarred, teachers were dismissed, civil servants were expelled, Jewish businesses were targeted, boycotted, and destroyed. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws formalized racial discrimination. Jews were stripped of German citizenship and reduced to subjects without rights. Marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews were criminalized. Identity was defined not by belief or behavior, but by ancestry. A person could be declared Jewish even if they had never practiced Judaism. These laws shattered the fabric of everyday life. Neighbors became strangers. Colleagues became enemies. Ordinary citizens were forced to choose between conformity and conscience. Most chose silence. Public humiliation followed legal exclusion. Jewish shops were marked and boycotted. Signs appeared reading, "Jews not welcome." Children were expelled from schools. Violence increased, often encouraged by authorities who refused to intervene. The escalation reached a new level in November 1938, during Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Synagogues were burned across Germany and Austria. Jewish homes and businesses were destroyed. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The state openly sanctioned violence. Kristallnacht marked the end of any illusion that Jews could survive within Nazi society. Yet even then, the regime still spoke of emigration and removal rather than extermination. The Holocaust, as it would later unfold, had not yet reached its final form. But the moral boundaries had already collapsed. Hatred had been legalized. Violence had been normalized, silence had become complicity. The machinery of destruction was now prepared. The Holocaust, the greatest crime of the 20th century war, ghettos, and the descent into mass murder. The outbreak of World War II marked a decisive escalation in Nazi policy toward Europe's Jews. War did not merely expand German territory. It removed constraints, radicalized ideology, and provided the conditions under which mass violence could be carried out with unprecedented scope. Conquest brought millions of Jews under Nazi control almost overnight, particularly in Eastern Europe, where Jewish communities were both numerous and deeply rooted. Poland became the central laboratory of Nazi racial policy. Following the invasion in September 1939, the country was divided, occupied, and subjected to brutal administration. Jews were rapidly targeted for isolation and control. They were forced out of homes, stripped of property, and concentrated into designated urban districts known as ghettos. These ghettos were sealed spaces, surrounded by walls, fences, guards, and laws forbidding contact with the outside world. Officially, they were presented as temporary measures. In reality, they functioned as instruments of slow destruction. Overcrowding was extreme. Families were packed into single rooms. Sanitation collapsed. Food rations were deliberately set below survival levels. Starvation became a daily reality. Disease spread rapidly through malnourished populations. Children scavenged for scraps. Corpses lay in the streets, sometimes for days. By 1941, tens of thousands had already died inside the ghettos, not through executions, but through calculated neglect. The ghettos also served a psychological purpose. They isolated Jews from the rest of society and reinforced propaganda portraying them as carriers of disease and disorder. Their suffering was used to justify further persecution. The longer the ghettos existed, the easier it became to imagine their inhabitants as less than human. Despite the conditions, life continued in fragile forms. Underground schools operated in secret. Cultural and religious practices persisted. Some Jews documented their lives, aware that survival was uncertain but determined that the truth would not disappear with them. While ghettos represented a phase of containment, they were never intended as a final solution. The turning point came in June 1941 with the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This campaign was conceived not merely as a military operation, but as an ideological war of annihilation. Nazi leadership framed it as a struggle between civilizations, where mercy was weakness and extermination was justified. Behind the advancing German army followed mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen. Their task was explicit: to eliminate perceived enemies of the Reich. Jews were targeted first, but they were not alone. Roma, communist officials, intellectuals, and civilians were also marked for death. What followed was a wave of mass shootings across Eastern Europe. Entire communities were rounded up. Victims were marched to forests, ravines, or open fields. They were forced to undress, line up, and were shot at close range. Men, women, children, and infants were murdered together. Places like Babi Yar, where tens of thousands were killed over the course of days, became symbols of this phase of the Holocaust. The scale was staggering. By the end of 1941, hundreds of thousands had already been murdered. These killings were not spontaneous acts of violence. They were organized, documented, and coordinated with military and administrative authorities. Local collaborators often assisted. The state apparatus functioned smoothly. Yet mass shootings revealed limitations. They were psychologically damaging to the perpetrators and logistically inefficient for genocide on a continental scale. Killing entire populations village by village required time, manpower, and secrecy that became increasingly difficult to maintain. At the same time, Nazi leadership faced a growing logistical challenge. Millions of Jews remained alive across occupied Europe. Ghettos were overcrowded. Deportation plans failed. Emigration was no longer feasible in wartime conditions. The question facing Nazi leadership was no longer whether Jews would survive, but how they would be eliminated. This question was answered not through emotion, but through bureaucracy. As 1941 turned into 1942, discussions within the Nazi leadership shifted decisively toward total extermination. The goal was no longer isolation, exploitation, or expulsion. It was annihilation. The machinery of genocide was about to enter its most systematic and lethal phase. The Holocaust, the greatest crime of the 20th century, the final solution and the machinery of extermination. By late 1941, Nazi policy toward the Jews of Europe had crossed an irreversible threshold. What had begun as discrimination, exclusion, and forced segregation evolved into a program of total annihilation. This transition did not occur in a single moment, nor was it announced publicly. It unfolded through meetings, memoranda, and administrative decisions, cloaked in euphemistic language and bureaucratic procedure. The shift toward genocide was driven by both ideology and circumstance. Nazi leaders believed that the war in the East was an existential struggle, and that the survival of the German state required the removal of what they defined as racial enemies. At the same time, the realities of war, millions of Jews under German control, overcrowded ghettos, failed deportation schemes, pushed the regime toward a solution that was final in nature. In January 1942, senior officials from across the Nazi administrative system gathered at a villa in Berlin for what became known as the Wannsee Conference. The meeting was not convened to debate whether genocide should occur. That decision had already been made. Its purpose was coordination, how to implement mass murder efficiently across occupied Europe. The language used was chillingly mundane. Human beings were reduced to numbers, categories, and transport problems. Deportations, labor capacity, and special treatment were discussed as logistical challenges. The banality of the setting and tone masked the enormity of what was being planned. From this point forward, the Holocaust entered its most systematic phase. Extermination camps were established primarily in occupied Poland, chosen for their distance from Germany proper and proximity to large Jewish populations. Unlike concentration camps, which combined imprisonment, forced labor, and terror, extermination camps were designed solely for killing. Their purpose was not punishment or exploitation, but death, on an industrial scale. Victims were deported by train from across Europe. Families were forced into overcrowded cattle cars with little food, water, or sanitation. Journeys lasted days. Many died before reaching their destination. Those who survived arrived disoriented, exhausted, and unaware of what awaited them. Upon arrival, selections were conducted within minutes. Guards and medical personnel determined who would be killed immediately and who would be temporarily spared for forced labor. The elderly, children, and the sick were usually sent directly to death. Mothers were separated from children. There were rarely explanations, only orders shouted in unfamiliar languages. Gas chambers were disguised as showers to reduce panic and resistance. Victims were told they were being disinfected. Within minutes, thousands could be murdered at once. Bodies were removed, valuables collected, hair cut, and remains burned. The process was repeated day after day. Death became routine. Those selected for labor faced a different form of destruction. Prisoners were stripped of names and reduced to numbers. Heads were shaved. Personal belongings were confiscated. Identity was erased. Food rations were deliberately insufficient, ensuring that most would die within months from starvation, disease, or exhaustion. Forced labor was brutal and meaningless. Prisoners carried stones from one place to another, worked in factories producing weapons for the very regime that imprisoned them, or labored in freezing conditions with inadequate clothing. Beatings were constant. Arbitrary executions reinforced terror. Families were systematically destroyed. Children had little chance of survival. Mothers were often murdered upon arrival. Fathers were separated and worked to death. The destruction of family bonds was not incidental. It was central to the process of dehumanization. Despite these conditions, acts of resistance persisted. Prisoners sabotaged machinery, smuggled information, and documented crimes at immense personal risk. In several extermination camps, organized uprisings occurred. Though most were crushed, they demonstrated that resistance was possible even in the heart of the killing system. The Holocaust was not carried out by a small group of fanatics alone. It required the cooperation of many sectors of society: railway workers who scheduled deportation trains, clerks who processed paperwork, engineers who designed facilities, doctors who conducted selections, and guards who enforced the system. Violence was embedded in bureaucracy. Equally significant was the role of collaboration across occupied Europe. Local authorities, police forces, and civilians assisted in identifying, arresting, and deporting Jews. Motivations varied: ideological alignment, fear, opportunism, or antisemitism, but the result was the same. The machinery of genocide extended far beyond Germany itself. The speed and scale of the killing were unprecedented. Entire communities vanished in weeks. Cities that had once been centers of Jewish life were emptied. By 1943, much of European Jewry had already been destroyed. Yet even as the genocide continued, information about it reached the outside world. Reports from survivors, resistance groups, and diplomats circulated. Allied governments were aware that mass murder was occurring, though the full extent was often difficult to comprehend. Responses were limited. Military priorities, disbelief, and political hesitation delayed action. The killing continued. By the time the tide of war began to turn decisively against Nazi Germany, millions were already dead. The machinery of extermination had achieved much of its purpose. But the story of the Holocaust does not end with death alone. It continues in survival, liberation, and the struggle to remember. The Holocaust, the greatest crime of the 20th century, liberation, justice, and the burden of memory. As the Second World War entered its final phase, the machinery of extermination began to collapse, not because it was abandoned, but because the advancing Allied armies were closing in. By late 1944 and early 1945, Nazi authorities attempted to erase evidence of their crimes. Camps were dismantled, documents destroyed, and prisoners forced on death marches away from the front lines. These marches became a final act of mass murder. Weak, starving, and ill, prisoners were driven across freezing landscapes with little food or shelter. Anyone who fell behind was shot. Thousands died not in camps, but on roads, in forests, and along railway lines. Liberation, when it came, arrived for many too late. When Allied forces entered the camps, they encountered scenes that defied comprehension. Survivors were emaciated, barely recognizable as human beings. Corpses lay unburied. Disease was rampant. The stench of death hung over the camps long after the guards had fled. Soldiers, hardened by years of combat, were overwhelmed. Many later testified that nothing in war had prepared them for what they saw. The Holocaust, once abstract or distant, became undeniable reality. Liberation did not bring immediate relief. Survivors faced profound physical and psychological trauma. Many had lost entire families. Homes no longer existed or were occupied by others. Antisemitism persisted even after the war, making return impossible for many. Displaced persons camps became temporary homes for hundreds of thousands. Survivors struggled with grief, survivors' guilt, and the challenge of rebuilding lives in a world that had failed to protect them. For many, emigration was the only path forward. The post-war world was confronted with a moral reckoning. For the first time in history, an international tribunal was convened to prosecute crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg trials sought to establish accountability for the architects of genocide. The trials exposed the inner workings of the Nazi system. Documents, testimonies, and film footage revealed the scale and organization of the crimes. Defendants often claimed they were merely following orders, a defense that was ultimately rejected. Individual responsibility was affirmed as a legal and moral principle. Yet justice was incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped punishment, reintegrating into post-war societies. Others were never identified. The scale of the crime made full accountability impossible. The Holocaust reshaped international law. Concepts such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and universal human rights emerged directly from its aftermath. Institutions were created to prevent such atrocities from occurring again. but remembrance proved as essential as law. Survivors began to speak, slowly at first, often decades later. Testimony became an act of resistance against forgetting. Museums, memorials, and educational programs were established to preserve memory and confront denial. Yet, memory is fragile. As generations pass, the Holocaust risks being reduced to abstraction or distortion. Denial and minimization persist, fueled by misinformation and ideology. The Holocaust was not inevitable. It was the result of choices, political, social, and individual. Ordinary people became participants through obedience, indifference, or silence. Others resisted, protected, and saved lives, often at great personal risk. The legacy of the Holocaust is not only one of destruction, but of warning. It demonstrates how fragile civilization can be when hatred is normalized, when institutions fail, and when human beings are reduced to categories. To remember is not merely to recall the past, but to accept responsibility for the present. The Holocaust demands vigilance, not only against antisemitism, but against all forms of dehumanization. Its lessons are universal, and its memory remains a moral obligation. History cannot be undone, but it can be faced. And in facing it, humanity defines who it chooses to be.